Millionaire wakes up from coma and is shocked to see who was by his side. Brian Belmont was the heir to a luxury hotel chain on his way to his wedding with Elizabeth Adams, a dazzling and beloved influencer. The wedding, announced as the event of the year, promised a spectacle of glamour and perfection. Yet amidst all this, Brian felt something strange, a nagging anxiety he couldn't shake off. Brian's phone vibrated. It was Elizabeth. He answered, hearing the impatient tone of his fiancée. "Brian, where are you? It's almost time. The paparazzi are everywhere, and the guests are arriving," Elizabeth said, unable to hide her impatience. "I'm on my way, Elizabeth. Don't worry, everything will be fine." He tried to reassure her with a calm voice, but the tension between them was palpable. He knew his words weren't enough to calm her. Elizabeth was obsessed with control, which only made him more uneasy. "I don't want to be late, not even for a minute. This is our day, Brian. Everything needs to be perfect." The word perfect seemed to have a special weight for her. A moment of distraction was all it took. The road narrowed at a curve, and Brian realized too late that he had lost control. In an instant, he felt the car skid, followed by a brutal impact. The world around him dissolved into darkness as the sound of sirens approached in the distance. The darkness seemed to engulf everything, and the dreams of an ideal life slipped through his fingers, leaving only a profound silence. The silence in the hospital room was broken only by the constant beeping of the machines monitoring Brian's vital signs. He lay unconscious, surrounded by wires and tubes that seemed like the last bridge between him and the living world. The accident had left him severely injured, and the doctors made the tough decision to induce a coma to help his body cope with the trauma and allow his injuries to stabilize. News of the tragedy spread quickly through the media. Suddenly, the headlines that once predicted one of the most anticipated weddings of the year now told a different story. Brian Belmont between life and death after severe accident. Entertainment shows discussed Belmont's critical condition, while reporters and photographers anxiously waited outside the hospital for any updates. Elizabeth arrived at the hospital shortly after Brian was admitted. She wore a meticulously chosen haute couture outfit and had an expression of pain that seemed rehearsed. As she entered the reception area, cameras captured her grave and worried face, but once the doors closed behind her, her expression shifted to one of frustration and impatience. She quickly pulled out her phone, checking messages and posts, while mentally reorganizing what this meant for her public image. However, her visits to Brian's room were brief and superficial. More concerned with projecting an image of a devoted fiancé, she only appeared to take photos beside him, posting dramatic messages on social media with captions like, "Waiting for you to come back to me," and "I won't give up on us." In reality, Elizabeth's emotions were more focused on the impact the accident could have on her career and public image than on Brian's health. While Elizabeth maintained her carefully polished public image, someone with much more sincere intentions was approaching Brian's room. Lucy was a young Latina from a humble background who worked as a cleaner at the hospital. Coming from a small town, she had immigrated to the United States in search of a better life. Despite the challenges, Lucy had a unique lightness, with a compassionate heart and a keen eye for details that others often missed. During one of her shifts, Lucy noticed the unusual activity in the corridor where Brian was admitted. She had heard about the accident like all the other hospital staff and felt a strange empathy seeing that young man confined to a bed between life and death. Although she didn't know him, something about the scene deeply moved her. In the following days, Lucy began to notice Elizabeth's behavior during her hospital visits. Observing from a distance, she realized that the young fiancé only showed up to take photos beside Brian and rarely stayed in the room for more than a few minutes. Her behavior starkly contrasted with Brian's delicate situation, making Lucy even more determined to offer something good, even if silently. So, Lucy started making small visits to Brian's room while she cleaned the corridors. She would discreetly place a flower on the nightstand, tidy the blankets, and whisper words of encouragement, as if she could transfer her energy and hope to him. At first, these actions seemed too small to make any difference, but to her, they were a way of telling the unconscious patient that he wasn't alone. The silent connection Lucy created with Brian was so discreet that no one at the hospital noticed her constant presence. She remained invisible, almost like a secret guardian, watching over Brian with sincere compassion and unusual dedication. With each shift, her visits became a ritual, and she started talking more, sharing stories of her childhood, her struggles, and dreams. Even though she knew he might never hear her, those nighttime conversations became a refuge for her. As time passed, Lucy began to notice small changes in the monitors tracking Brian's vital signs. Tiny signals, perhaps insignificant to others, made her believe he could hear her, that he was fighting to come back. And even though no one else noticed, she knew her presence meant something, as if she could pass on a part of her hope and will to live to him. Meanwhile, Elizabeth continued her sporadic visits, always accompanied by a camera or her phone, each photo carefully staged to capture the right moment. But within the hospital walls, it was Lucy who spent hours by Brian's side, whispering words of encouragement, filling the room with an energy that went beyond routine, beyond work, beyond the life she led. Night fell over the hospital, and the soft lights of the wing where Brian was gave the place an air of calm and serenity. Family visits had ceased, and the place became silent, as if the hospital itself were respecting the patient's rest. It was in this setting that Lucy, after finishing her shift, passed by Brian's room, as she had been doing since he was admitted. There was something special about Lucy's nighttime visits. They were discreet and quiet, and as she entered the room, she felt compelled to leave something positive, a welcoming energy that contrasted with the cold and impersonal hospital environment. That night, she brought a small wildflower she found in a planter outside. As she placed it gently on the nightstand beside Brian's bed, she paused for a moment, watching him in silence. Brian remained motionless, his vital signs monitored by machines that recorded every slight variation in his state. Looking at him, Lucy felt deep compassion and empathy she couldn't fully understand. She whispered, as if he could hear, "I don't know if you can hear me, but I want you to know I'm rooting for you." Her words were soft, almost like a prayer. "I don't know what your life is like outside of here, but I know you still have a lot to live for." Every night, Lucy returned, creating a kind of ritual. She sat beside Brian, watching him in silence and whispering words of encouragement. Over time, she began to share little pieces of her own life, almost as if she were talking to a close friend. She spoke about her family, the reasons that brought her to New York, and the dreams she held. Simple yet precious things. "I come from a small town," she said one night. "A town where people know each other by name and really care. Here it's different. Everything is so big." She paused, smiling as she recalled childhood memories. "Maybe that's why I like coming here, to be by your side. It reminds me of what really matters." These encounters became almost sacred for Lucy. She felt that her presence, no matter how small, somehow helped Brian stay connected to life. And over the days, she noticed he started to respond slightly, as if he could hear her whispers of encouragement. A finger that moved slightly, a heartbeat that fluctuated when she was there. Small signs, but for her, full of meaning. Outside, Elizabeth continued her routine of occasional posts about Brian's condition, keeping fans updated with photos and dramatic messages. But those actually at the hospital noticed her visits were brief and detached. Lucy, on the other hand, was always there, close by, almost like a gentle shadow caring for every detail, even though no one knew or recognized it. On one of the quietest nights, while Lucy was talking softly, she felt comfortable enough to share her own dreams. She told him about her desire to study nursing and someday help people beyond cleaning hospital rooms. "I don't know when I'll be able to make that dream come true," she murmured, almost to herself. "But maybe, when you wake up and get better, you'll find something new too, something that truly makes you happy." She smiled at the thought of the future, as if his presence, even unconscious, was a companion on her own path of discoveries. As she spoke, she felt a peace fill the room. There, beside this unknown man, who paradoxically seemed so close, Lucy found a refuge for sharing her most sincere thoughts. It was as if, in the quiet of the night, she could finally be seen, even if by someone who didn't know her. Over time, Brian's room became more than just a passing place. It became a space where Lucy could pour out her kindness and hopes, believing that he was fighting to come back. And somewhere deep in his unconsciousness, Brian seemed to catch those whispers of tenderness. It was as if his soul, suspended between life and death, stayed connected to the world through that gentle presence that surrounded him with warmth and comfort. Days and nights passed, and Lucy's routine became a source of strength for herself. Every time she entered the room, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, as if caring for someone in silence was a way to transform her own life. Watching Brian, she wondered about the moments they might share if he woke up. Unknowingly, Lucy had built an invisible bond, something not defined by words or promises, but rooted in the sincerity of her gestures and the delicacy of her care. Over the weeks, Brian's room became a backdrop for Elizabeth's mechanical and rehearsed visits. To her, the situation was becoming a burden. The accident had interrupted their wedding plans, and each visit to the hospital was a reminder that her day of glory had been indefinitely postponed. Still, Elizabeth made sure to be present, not for Brian, but for the public, following every step of his recovery. She entered the hospital with her eyes hidden behind large sunglasses and a calculated expression. Upon reaching Brian's room, she spent a few minutes looking at her fiancé, as if out of obligation, before arranging the perfect angle for a photo. Her social media overflowed with emotional posts, but the shine and empathy she tried to convey in the images remained only on the surface. Internally, she was more concerned with how this impacted her career than with Brian's health. During one of these visits, Elizabeth started discussing, to herself, plans for a renewed wedding she wanted to promote when Brian recovered. She spoke aloud, as if he could hear her, but the tone was more like a monologue than a conversation. "When you're well, we'll have a much bigger ceremony," she murmured, adjusting herself in one of the room's chairs and looking at her nails with disinterest. "It'll be an amazing event, with more glamour and more visibility. We'll attract even more attention." Elizabeth didn't seem to notice, but her words sounded almost empty in the room. The wedding talk, which should have been a symbol of love and commitment, now seemed like her personal project, a marketing piece. And as she spoke, her eyes didn't linger on Brian for long. Her mind was far away, caught up in thoughts of how to reorganize the narrative of their public life together. Outside the door, Lucy watched the scene silently. She was there to clean the corridor, but paused for a few seconds, surprised by Elizabeth's impersonal tone. From the start, Lucy had noticed how brief and always social media-driven Elizabeth's visits were. Even without getting too close, Lucy felt that Elizabeth treated her fiancé almost like an accessory, something to be maintained for appearances. As the days went by, Elizabeth's behavior became even more distant. She started reducing the number of visits, and when she did come, she spent only a few minutes by Brian's side, almost as if fulfilling an obligation. To her, Brian had become a problem to work around, a situation that needed to be adjusted so as not to interfere with her image and career plans. Elizabeth's coldness only made Lucy feel more connected to the patient. On the days when Elizabeth didn't show up, Lucy spent more time by Brian's side, refreshing the flowers, tidying the blankets, and talking to him without expecting anything in return. She felt her presence there made a difference, and as quiet as she was, her presence was constant, something solid amid Elizabeth's growing coldness and neglect. One night, as Lucy was preparing the room, she whispered softly, "You know, Brian, sometimes the people who are with us in tough times are the ones who really matter. I know things don't always go as planned, but don't give up. There's a lot of good waiting for you out there." She hesitated for a moment, wondering if she was overstepping, but something inside her felt he needed to hear those words. So she continued with her small, silent gestures, filled with meaning. Days at the hospital followed their monotonous rhythm, with the same sounds of machines, the comings and goings of nurses, and the deep silence surrounding Brian's room. But for Lucy, each visit to his room was a new opportunity to leave a trace of care and hope. One night, something unusual happened. While Lucy was adjusting Brian's blankets and whispering a brief prayer, she noticed a slight movement in his hand. It was almost imperceptible, but to Lucy it felt like a miracle. Her heart raced, and she leaned closer, watching every detail, as if that small gesture was proof that Brian was fighting to come back. Lucy walked into Brian's room once more, feeling the weight of the heavy routine she faced daily at the hospital. That night, the hospital was especially quiet. Lucy turned on the bedside lamp, casting a soft glow over Brian's face. He remained still, eyes closed, but to Lucy, it was as if there was a different energy in the air, something that made her heart beat faster, like an invisible change was about to happen. Sitting by the bed, she watched Brian carefully. Taking a deep breath, she felt an almost involuntary need to speak, to break the silence with words she hoped he could hear. "You know, Brian, life is full of unexpected paths," she began, whispering so as not to wake anyone in the corridor. "Sometimes we think everything is planned out, that destiny has something brilliant in store for us, but then things change." She gave a small smile, letting her hand rest beside Brian's. "Maybe you'll never know who I am, and maybe I'll never know who you really are, but I believe you're listening and that you'll come back soon." As she said this, Lucy leaned in, closing her eyes for a moment, feeling the faint warmth of his hand under hers. It was then that she felt a movement, an almost imperceptible squeeze that made her open her eyes immediately. Brian's hand, which had been still for so long, moved slightly, and his fingers slowly intertwined with hers. Lucy held her breath, her heart racing. She stayed there, in silence, watching that small miracle unfold before her eyes. It was as if, in the midst of darkness, Brian was finally finding his way back. Suddenly, the monitor beside the bed made a different sound, a small variation indicating changes in his vital signs. Lucy stood up, hesitant but not letting go of his hand. She leaned closer, waiting for another sign, some movement that would confirm what she had just witnessed. Brian moved his head slightly, and his breathing became deeper, as if he was trying to emerge from a deep sleep. Then his eyes opened slowly, blinking several times until they adjusted to the soft light of the room. Lucy was stunned, watching as he looked around, confused, and finally fixed his gaze on her. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Brian's eyes were lost, as if he was trying to understand where he was and what was happening. Lucy, still holding his hand, felt a mix of happiness and apprehension, and finally broke the silence with a gentle smile. "Hello, Brian," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You're back." Brian tried to speak, but his voice was weak, almost inaudible. He tried to remember what had happened, but his mind was cloudy, as if there was a void between the last moment he recalled and the one in which he now found himself, in that hospital room. After a few seconds, he mumbled, his voice hoarse. Where am I?" "You're in the hospital," Lucy replied, gently squeezing his hand. "You had an accident, but now you're safe. Everything's going to be okay." Brian stayed silent, absorbing those words as a series of vague images began to emerge in his mind. He remembered the car, the road, and then nothing. He tried to speak again, but the effort was too much. He looked at Lucy with a mix of relief and confusion, as if trying to recognize her face. "Do I know you?" he asked, still breathless. Lucy hesitated, feeling a lump in her throat. She knew he didn't know her, but she also knew that, somehow, they had formed a connection that was almost impossible to explain. She chose her words carefully, trying to convey calmness. "I'm just someone who's been here, taking care of you while you were resting," she replied with a gentle smile. "You don't know me, but I'm happy you're awake." Brian's eyes met hers for a few moments, and a deep silence settled between them. There was something in his expression that Lucy couldn't define. As if, even without recognizing her, he felt a familiarity, a calm that made the moment less frightening. Finally, he closed his eyes, exhausted, but with an expression of tranquility she had never seen before. As he fell asleep again, Lucy stayed there, feeling part of that awakening, as if a part of her had come back to life. It was as if, somehow, the whispers, the flowers, and all those nights by his side had created an invisible bridge between their souls. She gently released his hand, knowing that, at least for that moment, he was safe. When Brian opened his eyes the next morning, the fluorescent lights cast an almost surreal glow, and he needed a few seconds to adjust his vision. His body felt heavy, his chest tight, and his mind confused, as if he had woken up in a world he didn't recognize. Slowly, the emptiness of his memories was filled with fragments of the accident, the road, and then nothing. The sound of soft footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. When he looked at the door, a young woman entered the room with the careful posture of someone who didn't want to disturb the patient. It was Lucy, who, seeing him awake and alert, smiled slightly, unable to hide her surprise and joy. Her heart raced as she realized he was there, looking at her with attention, his eyes still tired but focused. "You're really awake," Lucy said, keeping her voice soft and welcoming, as she had done so many times while he was unconscious. "How do you feel?" Brian tried to respond, but his voice came out weak and hoarse. He took a deep breath, struggling to speak. After a second, he finally managed to mumble, "A little lost." How long have I been here?" Lucy hesitated before answering. She knew the truth might further unsettle Brian, but she decided to be honest. "You've been here for several weeks. The doctors had to put you in a coma to help you recover after the accident." Brian slowly processed the words, feeling a heavier weight as he realized the severity of what had happened. Each phrase brought a sense of disorientation, and he could barely organize his thoughts. His eyes turned to Lucy, trying to find some point of stability, something familiar to offer him security. "And you?" he asked, his voice a bit stronger but still full of uncertainty. "Who are you?" Lucy smiled, unsure of how to answer. How could she explain that, even without him knowing? She had been with him the whole time, almost like an invisible presence watching over his recovery. She tried to find simple words to explain her presence without revealing too much. "I work here at the hospital. I was just taking care of you," she replied, hesitant but sincere. "Sometimes I'd pass by your room and leave little things like the flowers. I don't know if you could sense it, but I believed that somehow you were listening." Brian's eyes fixed on her, an expression of confusion mixed with gratitude appearing on his face. As strange as it seemed, something about this young woman conveyed a sense of peace, a familiarity he couldn't understand. "I remember a voice," he murmured, staring into space, trying to recover hazy memories. "It was a soft voice, and I felt calm. Was that you?" Lucy nodded, feeling her cheeks flush slightly, not expecting that he had really picked up on anything from her silent visits. Every word he said was a small miracle, a confirmation that her hours by his side had been more meaningful than she had ever imagined. "Yes," she replied, her voice low but with a genuine smile. "I just wanted you to know you weren't alone. Even without knowing you, it felt like you needed someone there." Brian stayed silent for a moment, absorbing those words. He felt emotionally vulnerable, still confused about what he felt for this strange yet comforting presence. He tried to move his hand to hold Lucy's, but his body was still weak, and the movement was hesitant. "Thank you for being here," he murmured, feeling a wave of emotion swell in his chest. "I don't know what I would have done without that presence. It's hard to explain, but thank you." Lucy felt an unexpected emotion hearing those words. She hadn't expected gratitude or recognition. She just wanted him to come back to life, even if he never knew she was there. And now, being there next to him, while he expressed his gratitude, made her feel an even stronger connection, something she never imagined when she started visiting him. Their conversation was interrupted when a nurse entered the room, surprised to see Brian awake and interacting with Lucy. She quickly asked a series of questions to assess his condition, and as the medical team mobilized to check his vitals and plan the next steps of his treatment, Lucy stepped back discreetly to avoid interrupting the care. However, even from a distance, she felt Brian's gaze on her. He watched her with a mix of curiosity and a kind of recognition that was hard to explain. And as they took him for further tests and evaluations, part of Lucy wanted to stay there, waiting for his return. By late morning, after being assessed by the medical team, Brian returned to the room, exhausted but still with a calm expression. Lucy waited outside, a bit apprehensive about overstepping, but unable to ignore the connection that now felt so real to both of them. When he saw her, a brief, tired smile appeared on his face. "I think maybe it was your voice that brought me back," he confessed, his voice hoarse but full of sincerity. Lucy didn't respond immediately but smiled back, a smile laden with emotions. That journey of silence and waiting finally made sense. She knew it hadn't been her voice alone that brought him back, but something greater, a will to live that Brian had somehow found. Still, she felt touched by the depth of his words. "If I could help in any way, I'm glad," she replied, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. With one last exchange of looks, Lucy left the room, giving space for Brian to continue his recovery. She knew that waking up was just the beginning, both for him and for her. She felt that both their lives were about to change, even without knowing exactly how. And as she closed the door behind her, she felt her heart racing, the anticipation of what might come from that moment on. Brian Belmont's awakening quickly spread through the hospital and made headlines in local news and social media, drawing new attention to his recovery. The news soon reached Elizabeth, who, upon learning that her fiancé was finally conscious, hurried to arrange a visit to the hospital. For her, the timing was perfect. Brian recovered, the narrative of the surviving fiancé ready to be exploited. She knew everyone would be eager to see her by his side, a proof of her unwavering love. As she entered the hospital, Elizabeth adjusted her hair, checked her makeup, and walked towards Brian's room with firm steps. Her expression alternated between impatience and controlled confidence. She knew exactly what she wanted to do: give a quick visit to her fiancé, and of course, capture the moment with some photos that would surely be widely commented on. Meanwhile, Brian was trying to readjust to his new reality. The time he had spent unconscious still left him confused and with jumbled memories. The fragments of the accident and the days of darkness weighed on his mind like a distant dream. The only clear memory that remained, almost like a safety anchor, was the image of Lucy, with her whispers and constant presence by his side. Now, after his recovery, he was curious to know more about the person who had stayed with him for no reason other than pure compassion. He was thinking about this when the door opened, revealing Elizabeth. She entered with hurried energy, giving him a calculated smile. Brian tried to return the smile, but something inside him hesitated. It was as if this version of Elizabeth, with her rehearsed and affectionate behavior, didn't quite fit what he had expected. "Brian, my love," she exclaimed, leaning in to give him a quick kiss on the forehead. "You don't know how worried everyone was about you. I spent anxious days, but I never lost hope." Brian noticed that Elizabeth spoke theatrically, as if there was an invisible audience watching. He tried to smile, grateful for her concern, but her presence, which used to be familiar and comforting, now seemed distant, almost like it was being played by someone else. "Thank you, Elizabeth," he said, trying to find words to break the silence that settled between them. "I don't really know what happened while I was gone, but I'm glad to be back." Elizabeth nodded with a smile, taking out her phone to quickly snap a selfie of the two of them together. Brian, still recovering from the shock of the accident and the confusion in his mind, felt unsettled but allowed her to take the photo. When Elizabeth immediately posted it on social media with the dramatic caption, "Love conquers all," he felt a strange sense of discomfort. At that moment, the door opened again, and Lucy entered to deliver a new bouquet of flowers she had brought for the room. Noticing Elizabeth's presence, she hesitated and took a step back, but it was too late. Elizabeth's eyes met hers with disdain and impatience, and she gave a forced smile. "Who are you?" Elizabeth asked, her tone cold and unmistakably annoyed. Lucy, surprised, responded politely, not quite sure what to say. "I work at the hospital on the cleaning staff. I was just bringing flowers to the room." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow, her look overflowing with disdain. "Oh, I see. Well, thank you. But I think I can take care of my fiancé now. I don't think he needs your attentions anymore, right?" Brian sensed the tension in the air and instinctively looked at Lucy. Her expression was a mix of embarrassment and sadness, but she remained composed, not letting Elizabeth's words shake her. Something inside Brian reacted to Elizabeth's rude attitude, a sense of injustice he couldn't ignore. "Elizabeth, calm down," he said, interrupting her disdainful gaze at Lucy. "Lucy was by my side while I was in a coma. She took care of me in a way no one else did. She gave me strength." Elizabeth looked at Brian, surprised, and then at Lucy, clearly taken aback. The superficial smile disappeared, replaced by a poorly disguised look of irritation. "Are you saying that a hospital worker is more important than your fiancé?" Her voice was sharp and dripping with irony. Brian sighed, trying to control his frustration. Under normal circumstances, he might not have had the courage to confront her. But something had changed. The experience of the coma, Lucy's comforting presence during the darkest days, and the awakening that brought him a new perspective on what really mattered, made him feel different, more aware. "I'm not saying that, Elizabeth," he replied firmly. "I'm just saying that I recognize what she did for me, and I'm grateful for it." Lucy, sensing the situation was becoming awkward, gave a polite nod and started to leave the room. "I'll leave you two alone. I just wanted to bring the flowers and see how you were doing, Brian. I hope you keep getting better," she said with a slight smile before stepping out. Elizabeth watched her leave with a look of disapproval, and when the door closed, she turned back to Brian. "I can't believe you allowed that," she said, crossing her arms. "I'm your fiancé, Brian. I should be the only one who matters here." Brian felt a sadness wash over him. The woman he had long imagined as his life partner now seemed like a stranger, oblivious to what he felt and what he had experienced. That brief argument had been enough to open his eyes. He remembered the nights he felt a comforting presence, the soothing whispers that gave him peace. Elizabeth would never understand the value of that. As for her, everything was about appearances. "Elizabeth," he began, choosing his words carefully. "This accident changed something in me. I almost died. And while I was between life and death, someone stood by me in a way I never imagined. I can't ignore what I felt, and I won't pretend that nothing has changed." Elizabeth remained silent, surprised by Brian's firmness. She opened her mouth to respond, but seeing the seriousness on his face, she hesitated. Without a word, she gave a hollow smile, grabbed her purse, and left the room, leaving Brian alone with his thoughts. When he was alone, Brian felt a wave of relief and clarity. It was as if, for the first time, he could see his life with honesty. And in that moment, he realized that maybe what he felt for Lucy was more than gratitude. It was something he didn't fully understand yet, but deep down, it made him want to be a better person. Brian's hospital room was filled with a heavy silence, interrupted only by the sounds of the monitors. He was becoming more aware of himself and the details around him, but his mind was restless. As he waited for some test results, he noticed a nurse entering to adjust the equipment. "Good morning, Mr. Belmont. How are you feeling today?" the nurse asked with a cordial smile. Brian returned the smile, feeling grateful for the attention from the hospital staff. "I'm better, thank you," he replied, but hesitated before asking the question that had been bothering him since he woke up. "Nurse, I wanted to ask, do you know if my fiancée Elizabeth was with me while I was in a coma? I know it might seem like a strange question, but it's something I've been thinking about." The nurse, caught off guard, changed her expression. Her eyes showed a brief hesitation, as if she was evaluating what to say. Then, after a brief sigh, she replied, "Well, Mr. Belmont, Elizabeth came a few times, but I can say it wasn't very often. Most of the time, she seemed more concerned with keeping social media updated, you know?" The nurse looked at him with empathy, realizing the impact her words were having. "But you were very lucky. Someone was always by your side, even if quietly." Brian felt the weight of that revelation. His chest tightened at the thought that Elizabeth, his fiancée, someone he had trusted to face life with him, had left him to go through all this practically alone. The nurse's words continued to echo in his mind as he tried to process the reality. Elizabeth, who he had hoped would be his support, had not truly been there for him. The nurse gave him an understanding smile and moved away to leave him with his thoughts. But the emptiness and disappointment remained. Brian stayed still, his mind racing, feeling the weight of his expectations and illusions crumbling, questioning every detail of his relationship with Elizabeth. The next day, Elizabeth showed up to visit him. Impeccably dressed, with a confident posture, she entered the room with a smile on her face and her phone in hand, as if it was just another appointment in her schedule. "Brian," she exclaimed, moving closer to give him a quick kiss on the forehead. "I finally could come without the press following me. It's been chaos, you know, but I've always been here for you." Brian watched her in silence, struggling to hide his disappointment. Her words felt false, a reflection of the truth he now knew. "Really, Elizabeth?" he said, crossing his arms and looking directly at her. "You've always been here?" Elizabeth blinked, surprised by his tone. Brian normally didn't question her actions. "Of course I have, Brian," she said, her smile beginning to waver. "I come here every day, worried about you. Brian felt a wave of frustration wash over him. He took a deep breath, controlling his tone to avoid raising his voice. "Elizabeth, please," he murmured. "I know you barely showed up while I was in a coma. I know your visits were rare and that when you did come, it was more to post a photo than to actually see me." Elizabeth opened her mouth to respond, but the words seemed to have gotten lost. Her expression of surprise was quickly replaced by a mix of anger and resentment. "And who told you that?" she shot back, crossing her arms defensively. "Was it some nurse? This hospital is full of nosy people who don't understand what it's like to be in my shoes." "It doesn't matter who told me," Brian replied, his voice serious. "What matters is that I expected you to be by my side out of love, because you genuinely wanted to be with me, not for a status update. I was at death's door, Elizabeth, and you weren't worried at all." Elizabeth laughed, incredulous, a bitter laugh. "So that's it? You're going to throw everything away because of an accident? Do you have any idea what we've built together, Brian? How many people are expecting this wedding?" Brian looked at her, the sadness and disillusionment now evident in his eyes. He felt that the Elizabeth he had envisioned a future with seemed no longer to exist, if she ever had at all. "It's not about other people, Elizabeth. It's about us. Or at least it should be," he sighed, trying to stay calm. "But I realize we're together because of what people think, not because of what we feel. And that's not what I want anymore." She shook her head, clearly indignant, and stood up abruptly. "Brian, you're going to regret this," she said, her eyes full of disapproval. "When you realize you're throwing everything away, you'll remember who was there to offer you what no one else could." Brian stood there, alone, feeling a mix of relief and pain. The decision to end things had been painful, but he knew it was the only possible choice. Elizabeth had clearly shown that their connection was based on appearances, not true feelings. He leaned back in bed, trying to calm his mind, but despite everything, the sense of emptiness remained. In the days that followed, Brian anxiously awaited Lucy's visit. Since waking up, she had been his source of calm and comfort, and he wondered if she knew about the end of his relationship with Elizabeth. But days went by, and Lucy didn't show up. Lucy, on the other hand, stayed away, convinced that her presence might cause problems. Since her last encounter with Elizabeth, she feared that Brian's fiancée would see her as an intruder. Lucy didn't want to bring difficulties for Brian, especially during such a delicate time, and she thought it was better to give him the space he needed to sort out his life. However, Lucy's absence started to weigh on Brian. He missed her more than he had imagined. The lack of her visits, her encouraging words, and her discreet smiles made the room feel cold and empty. Every day he looked anxiously at the door, hoping to see her walk in with a bouquet of fresh flowers and a serene expression. But she didn't show up. The loneliness of the days without Lucy made him realize how essential she had become in his life. Brian remembered the moments when he woke up from the coma and heard her soft voice, the silent support she gave him when no one else seemed to care. Deep down, he knew he wanted more than her friendship. He wanted Lucy to know how vital her presence had been for his recovery, and that now he wished for her to be part of his new life. With that thought in mind, Brian decided that when he had the opportunity, he would tell her everything. He wanted her to know about the breakup with Elizabeth. Since the breakup with Elizabeth, Brian felt a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The decision had brought him a sense of relief and freedom he didn't even know he wanted. But despite this new energy, something was still missing. Days had passed since Lucy last visited him, and he deeply felt her absence. The hours they used to spend talking, the moments she brought him flowers and words of comfort, all of that now felt empty. Brian tried to hide his longing, convincing himself that she would show up soon, but each day without seeing her increased his restlessness. Determined to understand why Lucy had stopped visiting, he decided to look for her around the hospital. He asked some nurses, and finally, one of them pointed him in the direction where Lucy usually went during her breaks. Brian followed the directions and found himself in a quiet side corridor of the hospital, near the supply closet where cleaning materials were stored. He took a deep breath before opening the door, and there, on the other side, was Lucy, with her back turned, organizing products and arranging the cleaning cart. When she turned and saw him standing there, surprise showed on her face. "Brian," she said, her eyes wide. "What are you doing here?" He smiled, feeling relieved to finally see her, but also curious about the reason for her absence. "I came to look for you, Lucy," he replied, taking a step forward. "You haven't shown up for days, and I was worried. I was afraid something might have happened." Lucy looked away, fiddling with the cart to hide her nervousness. She didn't expect Brian to miss her or come looking for her, but she knew she needed to explain her absence. "I thought maybe it would be better to stay away for a while," she murmured, hesitant. "I didn't want to cause problems for you. After what happened with Elizabeth, I thought my presence might complicate things. I thought she might not want to see me around." Brian felt a wave of understanding and a bit of sadness hearing Lucy's words. He realized that her distance was out of consideration for him, but also that there was a hidden hurt, an insecurity that he needed to address. "Lucy, you don't need to worry about that," he said, his voice soft and sincere. "Elizabeth and I broke up. In fact, our relationship had ended a long time ago, but I just realized it now. You didn't do anything wrong." Lucy blinked, surprised, and finally looked at him. The news caught her off guard, and she didn't quite know what to say. "You broke up with her?" she asked, still trying to understand. Brian nodded, looking directly at her. "Yes, and believe me, it was the best decision I've made in a long time. I realized that what I want for my life is something real, something true. And you showed me what it's like to have someone who genuinely cares. During the time you were by my side, even when I was unconscious, it was like I was being supported, protected. I never felt that with Elizabeth. And now that I'm awake, I've missed you more than anything else." Lucy looked down, her cheeks blushing. She felt flattered and emotional, but at the same time, she didn't want to rush things. "I just wanted you to be okay," she murmured, her voice almost a whisper. "I thought that would be enough." Brian smiled, reaching out to gently touch her shoulder. "And it was. But now, I want you to come back and visit me, so we can talk like we used to, or maybe even more than before. I missed you, Lucy, and I don't want you to go away again." She looked at him, and after a moment of hesitation, she smiled, with a gleam of emotion in her eyes. "If that's what you want, I'll be there," she said, nodding slightly. In the days that followed, Lucy returned to visit Brian in his room, bringing with her the warmth and joy he had missed so much. Their conversations were now longer and more intimate. Brian opened up to her about his plans for the future, his desire to live a more authentic life, free from the pressures he had imposed on himself for so many years. And Lucy, in turn, shared the dreams she had held onto for a long time, of going back to school, advancing in her career, and one day being able to help more people. As the days went by, their bond grew stronger. With each visit, each conversation, Lucy's presence renewed him. Brian found in her not only the support of a friend, but something that inspired him to be better, to seek a simpler and truer life. And Lucy also saw herself changing, little by little. With Brian, she felt seen and valued, as if he truly understood who she was. With him, she could be herself, without reservations, without fear. She allowed herself to dream of the possibility of building something lasting, something that went far beyond the circumstances that had brought them together. Let's play a little game with those who only read the comments. Type milkshake in the comments. Only those who get this far will understand. Now let's continue with the story. Finally, on an especially calm afternoon, while they were both talking in the hospital room, Brian held Lucy's hand and looked into her eyes with an expression of tenderness. "Lucy, I don't know what my life would be like without you. Even without asking for anything in return, you've given me so much. You've helped me see what's really important. I want to be by your side. I want us to be part of each other's lives, not just here, but afterwards, anywhere." Lucy felt a deep emotion hearing those words. Her racing heart and sincere smile showed that, finally, they had found in each other something rare and precious, a true and genuine feeling that went beyond any circumstances. She nodded, squeezing his hand, her smile light and her expression full of hope. "I want that too, Brian. Since you woke up, I felt that my life would never be the same." And so, without needing more promises or vows, they established a strong and true bond. After weeks of recovery, Brian's discharge day finally arrived. He was ready to leave the hospital and move on with the life he knew would never be the same. Lucy accompanied him to the exit, with a smile that mixed joy and a touch of melancholy. After all, the moments they had shared in the hospital had created a deep and unforgettable bond between them. On the way to the car, Brian held Lucy's hand, smiling. "Lucy, I know this phase has been full of surprises and challenges, and I'm very grateful for everything you did for me. But I'd like to ask you to stay by my side on this new journey. I was thinking about offering you a position at one of my hotels." Lucy stopped, surprised, and looked at him with a mix of astonishment and emotion. "Work at your hotel?" she asked, her tone a mix of hesitation and surprise. Brian nodded with a warm smile. "Yes, I want to offer you a position you deserve. Someone with your talent and dedication can have many more opportunities. I want you to grow, to reach your dreams. I was thinking you could manage the reception area or even coordinate events. What do you think?" Lucy hesitated, feeling a wave of gratitude mixed with apprehension. It was a unique opportunity, and the thought of working alongside Brian and having a stable career was something she had never imagined. She smiled shyly, still processing the offer. "Brian, I would be honored. Working with you is an opportunity I never expected to have. But, you know, my dream is to be a nurse," she replied softly. Brian squeezed her hand, understanding her dilemma. "I know, and I want you to follow that dream. In fact, I was thinking of encouraging you to start nursing school. It would be perfect for you," he said, his eyes shining with encouragement. "I can help with the expenses if you need it. What do you think?" Lucy shook her head, a slightly embarrassed smile on her lips. "I appreciate it, Brian, but I want to do this on my own. I've always taken pride in achieving things through my own efforts. I promise I'll make it happen." Brian respected her decision, but in his heart, he already knew what he would do. Without her knowing, he arranged for part of the expenses to be covered in secret. It was a gesture he wanted to make with love and care, a way to give back for the support she had given him during his toughest times. In the months that followed, Lucy started working at Brian's hotel, where she quickly became an exemplary employee. The team soon admired her for her professionalism as she dedicated herself to learning and growing in a completely new environment. At the same time, she took her first steps in nursing school, fascinated by each new discovery and the possibility of one day caring for others the way she had cared for Brian. Brian watched it all with a mix of pride and emotion. Their relationship blossomed, marked by moments of closeness, respect, and affection. With each achievement Lucy reached, he felt even more connected to her, more certain that they were building something true and lasting. Months passed, and on a quiet evening, Brian took Lucy to the rooftop of one of the Belmont hotels, under the twinkling lights of the city. The air was fresh, and the sky was filled with stars, creating an almost magical atmosphere. "Lucy," he began, his expression tender and his eyes shining with emotion. "Since the moment you walked into my hospital room for the first time, something changed in me. And all these months have only confirmed what I feel. You gave meaning to my life. You showed me what true love is." He took a deep breath, gently holding her hand. "Will you marry me?" Lucy was silent, her heart racing and her eyes filled with tears. She had never imagined that this quiet and caring love, which had started with silent visits and simple gestures, would bring her to such a moment. She nodded, smiling through her tears. "Yes, Brian. Yes," she answered, her voice choked with emotion. That was the beginning of a new chapter, and their wedding, though simple and intimate, was full of meaning. With Brian's family and a few close friends present, they promised, with open hearts, to live together, support each other, and above all, seek a life founded on honesty and love. Years passed, and together, they faced challenges and celebrated accomplishments, supporting each other with the same dedication that had always defined their relationship. The marriage, though simple, turned out to be a deep and lasting bond that redefined their lives, placing values and compassion above all. Lucy thrived in her nursing career, and the dream that had started as a whisper beside Brian's hospital bed now flourished with each patient she helped care for. By his side, she built a career that was both her calling and a source of fulfillment. Brian, for his part, always felt proud watching her do her work with empathy and humanity. Even though she never discovered his financial contribution to her schooling, he knew that small gesture reflected what he always wanted for her, an open path to her dreams. The Belmont hotel chain, under Brian's leadership, also went through significant changes. Inspired by Lucy's example and the simplicity she had brought to his life, Brian began dedicating part of his profits to community projects. He created programs to support young people in vulnerable situations and invested in professional training for people seeking new opportunities, extending the positive impact Lucy had on his life to many others. As a couple, Brian and Lucy became known for their commitment to social causes and the quiet, yet genuine way they supported those around them. And whenever a new initiative arose, Lucy knew it was an extension of the love Brian had for her, a reflection of his desire to give back the care he had received during his most vulnerable times. The home they built together, away from the spotlight, was a cozy refuge where they created their own traditions and memories. On the walls, photos from trips and special moments reminded them of the days when they began to share a life. For them, every corner of that home was a witness to a story neither of them could have imagined living. One day, while sitting in the garden, Lucy looked at Brian with a serene smile. "You know, Brian, when I think about everything we've been through and how our lives intertwined," she paused, as if searching for the right words. "I never imagined we'd be here, together, with a life like this. It all started so simply, but at the same time, it feels like every detail was meant to bring us exactly here." Brian took her hand, returning the smile. "I never imagined it either, Lucy. But every moment with you made everything worth it. You showed me what real love is, and I only hope I've given that back to you in the best way possible." Lucy laughed softly, shaking her head. "You've done more than that, Brian. You've been my support, my best friend, and my greatest love. I can't imagine another life I'd want to live." And in that moment, as the sun set on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the garden, Brian and Lucy felt they had found in each other the happiness and sense of belonging they had always sought. It wasn't the life high society expected, nor a life of showy displays and fleeting glories. It was a genuine life, built on love and mutual respect, a life that they both knew was the deepest fulfillment of their dreams. What did you think of Brian and Lucy's story? Leave your opinion in the comments. On a scale from 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? If you liked it, subscribe to our channel and see you in the next video.